What a pleasure to be here with all of you. We are here to talk about reading diversely, but I want to just give you a little bit of background of what we're talking about here. Here's what I know about these United States, and these are figures from the 2015 census that came out last year. We are 77% white, 13% black or African American, 1% American Indian, 17% Latinx, and 6% Asian. I also know that we're 13% immigrants. That's a pretty big percentage. Here in California and on the coastal areas, New York and Chicago, we clearly are going to be much higher in terms of those percentages. I'm paying a lot of attention to these figures as of late because I'm also paying extra special attention to what's happening in the publishing world, which is the world that I've chosen to live in and work in. At the end of 2015, the publishing world was 88% white. It was 3% Asian, 4% Hispanic, 2% black or African American, and 3% mixed race. So I'm thinking about this in this way mostly. If art is the window to our souls, then shouldn't one of our most popular arts, the literary arts, also reflect what's happening in these United States? Shouldn't what we create reflect what's also going on in our demographics? And perhaps more importantly, shouldn't the people who are the gatekeepers to this very popular art, it's a $28 billion industry, also reflect what's happening in our demographic? So let me back up a bit. In the fall of 2013, I set out to publish this novel, this debut novel. I'll read you the back cover so we can be on the same literal page. Marty Wu, compulsive reader of advice manuals, is easily flustered. A spectacular career meltdown in New York sends her reeling to Taiwan in the comfort of supportive relatives. But even there, Marty is entangled in domestic drama. A formidable mother who's impossible to please, an annoyingly successful and well-adjusted brother, and a surprising family secret that pops up just when she doesn't want to deal with it. Mining the comedic potential of the 1.5 generation American experience, not a self-help book, is an insightful and witty portrait of a young woman scrambling to balance familial expectations and her own creative dreams. It ended up taking me a little over 16 months to actually find a publisher. I queried 85 agents, 21 small publishers, and then it was another year to publication date. Throughout the entire process, there were nibbles from people, from agents and from editors, who were really interested in taking a look at the full manuscript, which is really flattering and a kind of nice thing. But at the end of the day, the feedback was always more or less the same. They always all said either, I don't think I really understand the voice, or this isn't quite for me. So there's two me's in this story, right? There's the then me, the person who was querying back then and who was working on all these writers and editors and all these people that I wanted to sell my book. And that person said, this is OK. It's not a problem. I knew lots of people who had queried over 100 agents and 100 editors who never actually made it through the publishing process. I knew that if you're in a state where you're trying to get somebody to put all of their professional and personal resources behind a book, then it was going to be a tough road anyways to begin with. But the now me knows a little bit better, because very late in the pitching process, shortly before I signed with my publisher, I had a meeting with a really popular agent. This is somebody who represented the kind of books that I could see my book on the bookshelf next to. I could envision touring with the same authors that she represented. I really, really wanted this agent to like me, and I really wanted her to like the book. So she said to me, I really love this manuscript, and I can't wait to see a revision of it. And I was like, oh, OK. I don't really know what that means. I mean, I know it means that obviously not everything in the book is resonating with her. And that's completely fine, right? When a super good agent asks to see a revision of your book, you give her what she wants, right? You sit down with her, you have a really intimate conversation, and you ask her, what is it that you want to see changed? What would you like to see that's different? What's not working for you in the book, right? Did you guys know that when you remember something, you're not actually remembering the event itself. You are remembering the last time you remembered that event. So that's why the big fish stories keep on getting bigger and bigger and bigger. The last time you caught that fish, it just keeps on getting bigger and bigger and bigger, right? So in my head, the agent leans forward conspiratorially. She sets aside her glass of wine, and she's almost whispering to me. And she says, I think the mother character should be more Asian. I was really confused, because Marty Wu's mother is Asian. So I didn't really understand how you could actually be more Asian than being Asian, right? It didn't make any sense to me at all. So I asked her the question, well, can you tell me what that means? I'm not sure I understand. What does it mean to be more Asian than actually being Asian, right? Didn't make much sense to me. And she said, I want to see more broken English. I'd like to see more Asian food. I'd like to see more indicators of Asian culture. OK, so I should go on record here and say that this was very, very good advice for lots of different reasons. Okay, the first is that this agent has already represented a lot of Asian American books. So if it's my job to write the book, it's very much her job to go out and sell it. So if she's giving me prescriptive advice about what it actually means to write and sell a successful novel, then I'm going to listen to everything that she has to tell me, right? But the other reason is that the character in the book, Marty Wu, is very much Asian American. And if she is experiencing all these massive problems with her mother, which is causing a big rift, which is very much one of the big backbones of the book, well, then doing something like underscoring just how Asian Marty Wu's mother is in comparison to her could really only underscore the big rift that was coming between them that is going to lead to lots of these things that Marty Wu does in the book, right? So that's kind of where I went with it. And I should also say that I credit the agent a lot for what the book is today. But the experiences I've had since the book was published in May, and the ethnicities of people that I see reading it and reviewing it and responding to it, and what they're saying led me to think very, very deeply about what kinds of books make it through the publishing gauntlet to make it onto the bookshelf. Ethnic books, for example, or books that deal with multicultural issues, often take place in other countries, and they often take place in history, or they use other linguistic cues, much as the type of that the agent was suspecting I would do, in order to be able to signal their otherness, right? They want to put you in another culture. So I wondered, is there actually room in today's literary landscape for characters who sound Asian, but who still deal with stereotypes and with cultural hiccups? And if not, why isn't there room for this? Because I can tell you right now, most of my peer group speaks perfectly fluent English, but we still come from other cultures, right? So I wanted to know, well, where does that put the 13.1% of us that are immigrants who are having to deal with this sort of bicultural existence, right? Because it turns out that this book, which proves so polarizing in the pitching process, right? Pretty cover, okay, nice blurbs on the back, so on and so forth, actually has fans who are Latinx, who are African American, who are Jewish American, who are Irish American. It's being taught in college classes ranging from critical thinking all the way to American literature. That's incredibly flattering. But it does make you wonder, why was it having such a hard time getting through the pitching process? It's in its fourth printing now, having been out since May, so that tells me that there is room and there is an audience for a book like this. So I begin to think that the issue is this. While so many of us are in the creative world, trying to struggle for more representation on the screen and on the page, right? We see a lot of this going on in Hollywood now. You've got Tilda Swinton that's playing a character who is meant to be Asian, who isn't going to be Asian anymore because Tilda Swinton's not Asian, right? What's the name of the movie? Is it Doctor Strange? Yeah, I think it's Doctor Strange, that's right. So we're lamenting this lack of diversity from the top of the food chain on down, right? So we're agitating on the level of producers and on the level of directors, but we're also agitating on the levels of publishing houses and of editors. But we can also agitate on a more grassroots level. And I think what this means is that in order for us to see more diversity in blockbuster films and on the bookshelf, we need to be able to demand it as readers and as watchers of films and as consumers of literature. We have to get to the point of demanding it by becoming more conscious consumers. That's kind of where I've settled. So what does that mean? Well, we can start by taking a look at our own bookshelves, which is why we're all here today. What is on our bookshelves? While we were in school, we didn't really have to think about this a whole lot. Between general ed requirements and elective requirements, we kind of had our reading lives sort of shaped for us, right? We already knew what we were going to have to read because it was on the reading list that was passed out to us when we started school, right? We didn't have much time to pursue our own interests, although this one over here somehow found a lot of time to read a lot of Stephen King and a lot of V.C. Andrews. I don't know how. I think I read them in math class, which explains an awful lot. So, okay, we read the classics, right? We read Shakespeare, Blake, Thoreau, Hawthorne, Melville, Salinger, Fitzgerald, Steinbeck, Twain. Okay, we've all read all those characters. Okay, so where are the women, you're asking, right? Okay, so maybe later on we got to read Willa Cather, we got to read the Austens, we got to read all the Brontes, we got to read all these books that form the literary backbone of what we know in terms of our education, right? Okay, so are we seeing a pattern? Yes, of course we're seeing a pattern. They're all white, right? That's completely okay. There's no reason for anybody to discount the actual contribution that this group has made to our literary canon. It's so important for us to know about these people and for us to read them. Okay, so we got older and we went to college, all right? And we started to be able to pick classes, right? We started to be able to look at things that we really wanted to read. And you got to choose classes with literature in them written by people who represented maybe more of our peer group, people who were around us, right? So then we got to read Maya Angelou, and we got to read Sandra Cisneros, and we maybe got to read Ta-Nehisi Coates. Students today are reading Claudia Rankine. That's a really lovely thing. But this is the point, because we had to sit there and make a conscious decision. You had to look for classes that were titled Women in Lit, or Asian American Literature, or Post-Colonial Literature, right? If you didn't make that extra step and make that leap to decide that you wanted to study these people, you weren't really gonna have a chance to go get them, okay? So you did this by looking at yourself and looking at your reading list against the backdrop of this unconscious bias that is ruling the news cycle today, right? And you did this against the backdrop of years worth of an education that told you, well, this is the stuff that you should be reading, this is the stuff that everybody should be reading, okay? The system handed you what I'm referring to as the low-hanging fruit of literature, which is not to say that it's bad fruit. It's very, very good fruit, but you didn't have to actually do anything to get to it. It's right there in front of you. You didn't have to reach for it or dig for it or root for it. It was right there, right in front of you at eye level on every single library shelf and every single bookshelf. Okay. But if we look around here today, the writers that are the easiest to find, the ones that are consistently getting reviews and coverage and publishing deals, these people don't represent the reality of your peer group. They don't reflect the realities of your friends. They don't reflect the realities of people you know or the people that you want to know. And indeed, they don't reflect the reality of our news cycle. Every single day, we're getting news from around the world that is all about the people who are around us, who are of different ethnicities and who have different cultures. So for me, the question is, don't you want to know more about your friends and their peer groups and their histories and the way their families were when they were growing up and their cultures? I mean, I think we all kind of do, right? So after I went through the experience of pitching my book and realizing just how shaped my reading life had been for me, I took a hard look at my own reading list. Now, I told you before that I'm really bad at math and I can't count, right? So I just took the last 100 books that I read, which was easy because 100 percentage points makes up a full consort, right? So I wondered, did my reading list reflect the demographics of our American society today? In other words, was I reading 77% white people and 12% African American? Did I manage to squeeze in the one Native American book that would represent the 1% of Native American populations? Was I even getting to the 6% of Asian American books? And the answer is no. Now remember, this is me actually being cognizant of this whole thing, right? So what was the problem? I mean, it wasn't that I don't love to read. It wasn't that I'm not familiar with a lot of writers out there who are doing great things. Nobody, by the way, should feel bad because they're reading what they like to read. That's not a cardinal sin. What I think is happening is that I love, for instance, mysteries and thrillers. And I didn't know that there were mysteries and thrillers out there that were written by minorities. So I had to go hunting for them. And I'm really glad I did, because when I did find them, I ended up reading them in great swaths and 3 or 4 books at a time. It was really great. I'm in the middle of an African-American detective series right now that I really, really like. Oh, 2 actually. I get to tick another one off my list. That's a really good thing. Although, now that I'm thinking about it, it's actually Luther, which is a great BBC series about a black detective, but it's written by a white guy, so I'm not sure that actually counts. I may have to rejigger my system. Anyway, so I'm really glad that I took the extra work to find them. And I suppose the last thing I want to say is that last week I committed the cardinal sin of engaging in a vaguely political conversation with somebody on Facebook. It was really stupid. I'll never do it again. I do not recommend it for anybody. It's a bad idea. But her ending sort of parting shot at me was, and I quote, "Racism is bringing race into the subject." And I didn't really know what to make of that. So I'm not actually here to make this a political conversation. This isn't a conversation about politics, right? It's a conversation about what we love to do in our spare time. We love to read. But it is a conversation about art, which sometimes can be political. More importantly, it can be a critical way forward in talking to people about lots of different things that we may not have had the opportunity to talk about before. It can also be a way forward in terms of connecting with somebody that you have nothing else in common with, which is kind of a very, very big deal right now. So here's what I know. I have decided that we really only read for 2 reasons. One, we read to get to know somebody new. Nobody picks up a book and says, "I can't wait to get to know more about this building," or "Gee, I really want to know more about that landscape." We read because we're interested in getting to know a sector of people that has shaped history or a landscape. We read because we want to get to know somebody who's described on the back cover of a book, and we can't wait to know what that person does with his or her life. The other reason we read is to get to know ourselves. We read to find that sensitivity that tells us that somebody else has been in our shoes and somebody else has walked in the same experience that we have. We read to feel less alone. We read for solidarity. We read to feel connected to somebody else. So this, I think, for me, is the reason that it's so important to read diversely and to make this concerted effort to do so. We're here because reading widely allows us to get to know so many more people without really having to do a whole lot of work for it. So many more of these people's motivations we can get to know. We can get to know their joys, and probably most importantly in the climate that we're in right now, we get to know their fears, which I think is a very, very big deal. So that's why we're here today, and we're here to figure out how best we can do that without making too much of a hash of it. And I'll turn it over to Jackie now. So thank you all for being here and for tuning in.
Yeah, thank you, Yi Shun.
Oh, you're welcome.
So when you discuss the availability of diverse art, can you tell us a little bit of what you found when you started looking for it?
Yeah. So I have a friend who is an executive editor at a pretty big publishing company. And she single-handedly is publishing more diverse literature than her entire department combined, which I think is really just an extraordinary feat on her behalf. She is looking for narratives that break the mold in a certain way. There are great editors out there and great publishing companies that are looking to do that sort of thing, and they are looking for the kind of story that a different demographic can tell. What I did find, though, is that it's easiest to go to small and micro presses, places that publish 1 to 5 books every single year that are really paying attention to the different types of narratives that there are to be had out there. So for me, my easiest gambit is always to go look for the small presses. Milkweed Press, Grey Wolf Press, my own publishing press, which is Shade Mountain Press, does 1 book a year, and they pick a different demographic every year. So one year it was LGBTQ. Another year it was poetry. Another year it was women's issues. And I was lucky enough to be selected one year. Next year we're doing a Black narrative. So it's one of those things that you just have to be cognizant of who's publishing what and be able to find a way to get to those presses.
Do you think that I don't know? Would you be comfortable telling us about how your family accepted your?
Yeah. Absolutely. So I mentioned before that there are a lot of mother-daughter issues in the book. And I think one of the beauties of this book and one of the most extraordinary things about it was that I really wasn't telling a story that we hadn't all heard in some way, shape, or form. The story of a young woman trying to make her way and having to make the choice between filial responsibility and her own life dreams is something that we can all get behind. At the beginning, we were pitching the book as a mashup of Bridget Jones's Diary and the Joy Luck Club. You think to yourself, how do we get to that point? What does that even mean, right? But the reality is that there are so many of us today, regardless of the demographics that we're in, that have to deal with the same types of struggles, right? It's a universal story, right? How do we find ourselves and how do we remain true to ourselves? So to answer your question more directly, my parents were like, oh, did you write this book to have revenge on us? And okay, the obvious answer is no, right? Duh. And also, it's fiction, right? But there are these stories that you hear that ring true, that are universal. And I will be honest and say that I worried over the years that I spent writing this book, I worried that somebody else was going to tell this story. Because I couldn't understand why it was that nobody was telling the story, right? It seems so universal to me. We're all of us are stuck between cultures at some point in time, whether that's our own little nuclear family culture and having to go to high school where everybody is different and you've got these two different worlds, or if it's something as broadly reaching as a cultural gap. So that's what it was.
I think a lot of Asian cultures, other minority cultures, don't necessarily see writing as a way to express or improve their situation.
Yeah.
And so, was it difficult being an Asian writer?
Yeah, there's a lot of us out there. You'd be surprised. When I do these talks, I typically will get the young Asian American woman who comes up to me afterwards and says, "What did your parents say when you told them you wanted to be a writer?" And I can never tell her the truth, which is that my parents always wanted me to be something other than. They wanted me to be an attorney, right? But I'm very loose about the definition of writing. I mean, I kind of figure there are people out there who write social media feeds for a living, and I think they're absolutely writers, right? Of course, they're all working on some kind of great American novel in some way, shape, or form. But I agree. There is this sort of constant argument over what construes a genuine career, right? Are you actually working legitimately legitimately if you're not earning a paycheck from a very well-known company, and if you're freelancing. But yeah, I think it's becoming more and more of a viable career path in everybody's eyes. I like to think that in the future I won't get quite so many young Asian girls coming up to me and asking me what my parents thought when I told them I was going to be a writer.
It's a big deal.
It is. It is kind of a big deal.
Yeah,
Absolutely.
yeah. And it's unfortunate. There's, we talked a lot about ethnicity as diversity, but there's other types of diversity.
Right.
Were you able to, find other kinds of maybe gender-based, sexuality-based?
Yeah, absolutely. So about 12 years ago, I read a book called Luna, and it was about a young woman who has a brother who's transitioning into, he's transitioning from male to female. And I remember thinking to myself, I feel so grateful to be alive during this time when we can have these conversations about this sort of thing. And it was a book that was a middle grade book. So it's a book that's written for 8 to 13-year-old kids, right? And it was, I think, in many ways a groundbreaking book, but I think we're seeing more and more of that. And I am trying really hard to find those books. And again, the beauty of small press and micro press is that oftentimes you will see these presses laying out for you their credo, the types of books that they want to publish. So in many cases, that's the new low-hanging fruit for me, right? Is being able to go to their websites and say to myself, this weekend I think I'd really like to try and read a book about a lesbian woman who is caught up in this, that, or the other thing. Or I'd be really interested in hearing about what it's like to live the queer lifestyle, or what it was like to live the queer lifestyle in the 1960s, right? And you can find those books. And you can easily get at them, which is great. The internet is a beautiful thing, you guys. It is a beautiful thing. It really is.
You're welcome. Okay.
Yeah, exactly right. Thank you, Google. Precisely.
So I remember when I was in elementary school, probably reading Pearl S. Buck.
Okay, yeah.
What do you consider Pearl S. Buck a diversity author, or like what?
I do. I mean, we can parse this into a million different ways, right? The idea of a white woman writing about the things that she's experienced while she was living the missionary lifestyle might at first blush look like it's not a diverse narrative, but it is very much her perspective on what she witnessed while she was growing up in China as the child of missionary parents. And I think that is a diverse viewpoint. There's a lot of talk now around cultural appropriation and whether or not it's okay for somebody who isn't one demographic to take on the persona of that demographic. Lionel Shriver is a very well-known author who wrote We Need to Talk About Kevin, which is a book about, it's told from the point of view of the mother of a child who shoots up a school. And she came on stage in Brisbane at a very well-attended talk wearing a mini sombrero. And kind of went on a little bit of a rampage about how it wasn't fair that white writers were constantly being accused of appropriation. Okay. I think it is first and foremost a writer's job to create a world that we can all believe in. We've all read the book where the character runs from 22nd Street in New York all the way up to 75th Street in Manhattan in 3 minutes flat. That's called taking the reader out of the story, because everybody knows that you cannot run from 22nd Street all the way up to 75th Street in 3 minutes flat. It is not going to happen. And it was one of the key problems with the Bruce Willis movie. What's the name of that movie? It was one of the Die Hard movies, where they actually got in a cab and they tried to go all the way down to Wall Street in split time or something to that effect. Anyways, for me, so long as a writer is responsible and doesn't take a reader out of the story, then I think it's okay for a writer to try and stretch. I've had conversations before with college students who are trying to put their feet into different people's shoes. And I think it's okay for you to try that. Is it risky to try and publish that kind of thing? Yeah, I absolutely think so. But you have to do it right. And if you're telling the story right, then maybe nobody will notice, and that would be a really good thing. But in terms of your question, I think I would still consider her viewpoint to be really valuable. Whether or not I would refer to her as a diverse author, I might not. But I think she's telling a story that's pretty important to tell.
Yeah, maybe it's like you grew up a certain way.
Yeah.
Or
right.
Yeah.
Exactly. I mean, people's backgrounds are important, right? And I don't actually know, because none of us was alive back then. But I don't know if we had the same kind of biographical information about Pearl Buck as we do now about an author, right? you're interested in an author right now, you can look up their social media feeds and you can read them from beginning to end, and you can follow them on Twitter, and you kind of know what they eat for breakfast, and you know who they are, and you know that they're Asian, and you know that they are queer or whichever, right? But I'm not sure that we knew that about a Pearl Buck when we were growing up, or when the book was published. So the question for me is whether or not these biographical details actually make it better, or does it make it worse? Does it make for a more diverse literary atmosphere or a less diverse literary atmosphere? For somebody like me who's trying really hard to read diversely, I think it's a really good thing to have these biographical details at our fingertips.
Cool. How does it feel to have your book being talked about and studied in school?
Oh, I'm shaping my minds, you guys. Shaping young minds. Do you know what? It's really flattering. And it's really wonderful. And I also think it's a little bit bizarre because college professors end up interpreting your work in ways that you never, ever, ever thought it would be interpreted, right? So the first class this book was ever taught in was a critical thinking class, which is kind of funny because my character does not think critically. She's kind of an airhead in lots of ways. And it's not until the middle of the book that we figure out that she has this internal life, that she's trying to work her way around. So it's really nice to look at your book through somebody else's eyes. It is a great pleasure to go into a college classroom and speak to students about the way that they're viewing your book and learn about the way that they're interpreting it. But it also is really nice to know that you're helping them to feel a lot less alone. That's a really valuable addition. I mean, it's kind of like the frosting on the cake, right? It's very cool to think of a book like this being taught in American literature class. That I think is kind of where diverse books should belong anyways, right? We don't want to be in a situation where all diverse literature is only taught in diverse literature classes. Because at the end of the day, it's just nice to know that you're part of the American literary canon, right?
Have you learned anything new from how the students or the teachers are interpreting your book?
Yeah, I think it's really interesting to find out how many students are conflating the author with the character. Not the same people. I had to draw them a diagram, and right there on the whiteboard, and just kind of list the differences between me and Marty Wu. But I think there is any writer of fiction who tells you that there is no intersection at all between real life and the character that's in the book is lying. I mean, the film between fiction and nonfiction can be very, very thin at times. And we often do write what we know, right? But the question is, well, are we writing what we've overheard? Because writers do a lot of eavesdropping, right? We're the people in the coffee shop who are like, say that again? What did you just say? But I thought it was really interesting how unwilling the students were to believe that there was actually a difference between the character and the author. They were really curious. They were kind of hunting for similarities.
So you mentioned earlier a little bit, or you mentioned a few times about small press versus large press. Can you tell us what happened as you looked and found these distributors?
Well, the publishing world is really interesting right now because there are so many opportunities for writers to publish. And I've heard lots of people say that there has never been a better time to be a writer. And I kind of agree. But I'm of the vintage, I'm 42 at this point, and I'm of the vintage where I believe that it's nice to have a team behind you. So I'm not really a fan of the whole go it alone route, right? Also, I have another book to write and I don't want to spend all of my time marketing my book, right? So 40 hours a week goes into some book marketing, and I'm just not that interested in spending all of my time book marketing. And it's nice to know that you have a team behind you, right? But as I mentioned before, it is really nice to know that small presses are out there championing the voices that likely would not get heard, the stories that wouldn't get told. I just feel like we're in such a good time right now for writers. I wish small presses would get more of a higher profile, and I think that there are plenty of them that are doing great jobs. Grey Wolf has published a volume of James Franco's poetry, and I'll tell you what: if there is one way to boost your press into the high profile, it's by publishing a major Hollywood star's poems, right? And I'm not very good at poetry, so I can't pass any judgment on that. But I think it's really cool that big Hollywood stars are looking at small presses for their work, But in terms of the self-publishing world and in terms of the big five publishing world, there are only 5 big publishers left. I mean, there used to be lots and lots and lots of them, but gradually as the publishing world has expanded, they've become conglomerate after conglomerate after conglomerate. The good news about these big presses is that they all have imprints. So there are often editors like my friend who are working really hard to make sure that diverse voices are getting heard and seen. So I think we're in a really good place for the publishing world, and I think we're in a really good place to publish more diverse literature, right? It's like infinite. I mean, it's there's another publisher out there whose name I will not mention because it's also a very, very big conglomerate of lots of other things, selling everything from groceries to books. But they have a publishing imprint, and that's doing very, very well. And in fact, that publishing imprint is actually doing a lot to publish books in translation. So it's a very, very good time to be a reader, for sure.
For those of us who don't know, what is the difference? What would you consider to be the difference between large press, small press?
Okay, so there's a big set of numbers around this that I actually did not write down, so I can't tell you specifically. But the large presses are presses like the traditional publishing presses like HarperCollins, Random House, and Hachette. Okay, so those are like the big, and Penguin, right? Well, Penguin, of course, is now part of Random House. So those are the big publishing houses. And then there are the smaller publishing houses, like I've mentioned, Shade Mountain Press, Grey Wolf, Red Hen Press out of Los Angeles is another really, really wonderful press. And then there are the micro presses that do one-offs, where it's just, again, like the one book a year, or they'll do one book every couple of years or so. But those presses will often take what we call unsolicited queries, which is where a writer can just submit his or her manuscript directly to the press without having to go through an agent. At the larger presses, it can be harder to do so. So you have to go through an extra step of getting through that gauntlet, right? So that's the way that works.
Okay, so it's not like a number of books published.
Yeah, no, it's that too, but those are the numbers I don't have with me. So, but I'm sure we can find those later on somewhere on the internet.
Yeah. How about what inspired you to write about Marty Wu?
I think we all have a Marty Wu in our life. We all have that friend who screws up on a regular basis and who keeps on asking you for advice. And you keep on giving her the right advice. And she keeps on not taking that right advice. Okay. Also, I have kind of a beef with self-help books. There's a really popular one out there who encouraged you to write for 15 minutes every morning, no matter how much time you had, right? And you had to carve out time for your morning pages. They were called morning pages. It was very serious. And I've tried really hard, but I would fall asleep in the middle of my morning pages. Mostly, I think I'm angry at self-help books because none of them work for me. And I think this is the problem with this character, right? Is the fact that she has this incredible stack of she is rabid about self-help books. She buys them in every way, shape, and form, and she catalogs exactly where she buys them for you. So she will tell you where she bought them. And the thing is, what she's looking for is a manual about how to be the next version of Marty Wu, right? She wants to be. I actually poached this directly from a reviewer, so I cannot take credit for this, but I thought it was a really good way of describing it. She said that Marty Wu is looking for a self-help manual that will describe to her how to be Marty Wu 2.0. But she can't find it. There isn't one of those, right? So it's very hard to find a manual that will allow you to be the better version of yourself, right? But I wrote her because I thought she was a missing voice. I had mentioned before that I really worried that in the years that it was taking me to write this book, somebody was going to figure out that this voice hadn't been written, but that it was all around us. I mean, right here in this room, we have multiple people who speak fluent, unaccented English, but we're from different cultures, right? We have all these different backgrounds that we have to consider. So I just thought that she was missing, and I wanted to tell her story. I thought she was kind of she's the missing 13%, that for some reason the publishing world wasn't addressing yet. So I kind of wanted to get her out there.
Cool. How about translations? So, there's lots of, just because of the fact that we are reading in English, that might affect diversity. But there are translations of books from other languages.
Yeah.
How do you figure out what kind of translation you want to read, or how do you pick these?
Yeah, translations are a sticky wicket. It is possible to have very bad translations. I love the book Crime and Punishment. I took a Russian literature class that was taught by a guy who had read multiple versions of it, and he chose this one to teach us. And then years later, probably another 20 years later, a younger cousin of mine, not you, somebody else, said to me that she was being taught Crime and Punishment in her class, and she was really sad because she knew it was one of those books that you're supposed to like, and you're supposed to really, you're supposed to get something out of it or whatever, but she couldn't get behind it. So I said, well, show me the version you're reading, and it was a translation that was just unpalatable. I could not get behind it. I didn't understand why they were using this version of this book in her class. So I gave her my copy, and sure enough, she loved it to pieces. So I actually asked this question of a friend of mine who commissions a lot of translations, and she told me that it really does come down to voice. If you're reading a book that you just don't like the voice of, then you're going to put it down, right? If you don't like the character, if you don't like the narration, you don't like the way it works. So when we talk about good translations versus bad translations, what you're really looking for is whether or not the translation can actually encompass the essence of the book, right? So, for instance, the same editor that I spoke to about this told me that she had commissioned a normally literary translator to do a translation of what would have been like a Dan Brown thriller type book. And she said that the writing that the translator came out with was eventually so literary that it didn't suit the pacing of the book. So they eventually ended up having to find another translator to go with when they ended up publishing the second version of this book. At the end of the day, if you're not reading something that resonates with you, then you should put it down and either find another translation or walk away from that book and find something else entirely different to read. But for me, I tend to look at a translator's background, what types of book he or she has been translating in the past. And there are also writers out there who will only work with one specific translator. And that's probably because they have found that this translator is the best at covering all of the nuances of the work, and making sure that the essence of the book moves from one translation, one language to another, right? Okay. So that's the way that I look at it, I think. What translations did you read recently that you liked?
Crime and Punishment? No, The Three-Body Problem, actually, it's originally written in Chinese.
Right, okay.
I don't remember the name of the translator. I think it was Kevin something. Anyway, the first book is translated by one guy who is like well known for his science fiction.
Right.
And is also of Asian descent.
Interesting.
Yeah, and then the second book in that same series is translated by somebody else, and it was apparently not as good. I don't know.
So have you read the second book yet?
I haven't read the second book yet.
Okay, so now I'm curious to see what Jackie thinks of these two different types of translators, right? Because you're talking about two very different types of writers, people who translate specifically different work. So I bet the tonality is going to be really different.
Yeah, it'll be different.
But this editor I spoke to also told me that there is a process that you go through when editors hire translators for different books, or when publishers hire translators, right? So, for instance, if the book that is being translated is also being translated if it's being translated in English language, then it is possible for the UK publisher as well as the US publisher to get together, and they'll pool their funds and pool their resources and try to find a translator that works for them both. But yeah, at the end of the day, it really just does come down to voice, right? I mean, you're not going to read a book that you don't enjoy in the English language, so why would you read a book that you don't enjoy in another language, right? So that's the way it kind of works out for me.
Awesome. I think that is all the questions I have. Did anybody in the audience have a question for Yi Shun?
Do you guys have questions? So the question was, do I think that publishers are limiting the voices that are out there out of an unconscious bias, right? Or because they're limiting it out of market pressures? Is that about right?
Yes.
Okay, so I think it's a little bit of both. I have heard stories of agents who are pitching publishers who will then say things like, well, we did a black book last year, or we already have an Asian author, which is really depressing because, like I said, right, it's 12% of the U.S. population is black, so how can you just tick off the one black author as being A-okay, right? So I think there's part of that. Some of it is market pressures from within the company, right? If they've already done an ethnic book, then maybe they're not as likely to do another one. But the other part of it too is a real fear that once you get the book out to market, it won't sell. Because maybe the publisher doesn't know how to talk to that demographic. Or maybe they don't realize that talking to that particular demographic just means speaking to the worldwide audience at large. Because guess what? People want to know about other people. They want to read about that. The unconscious bias part of it, I think, is a little bit trickier. Because as I mentioned early on, every single editor and every single agent is a human being, right? So do we all carry around unconscious biases? Absolutely, no question about it. Maybe this person isn't familiar with this particular brand of literature. Maybe he or she doesn't know what to make of it. I think if you break it down to a very human level, it ends up being a lot easier to parse that question. So I don't know, and it's not a very good answer, sorry. It's not all that complete. But I do think it's a little bit of both.
What about if, I mean, so just kind of adding on to that, what about if you have a book that is written by an author who has a different ethnic background,
right,
but doesn't really talk about, you know, ethnicity at all?
Yeah.
I mean, would you consider that a diverse book or part of your diversity?
Well, I think it's, so my next book has nothing to do with ethnicity at all. It involves time travel and Ernest Shackleton and Milwaukee, of all things. But, you know, it's one of those books that, that I think is going to be interesting just by dint of its subject matter. The main character is not Asian. She's not any ethnicity at all. She's just a girl, you know, growing up in Milwaukee. I would still consider it, a book by a diverse author, certainly. And I would encourage people to read books like that for lots of different reasons. I have a friend who thinks it's her responsibility to write ethnic characters. I'm not at that point yet. I'm quite selfish. I think there are a lot of writers out there who are quite selfish this way and who just want to write the story that's within you know, our hearts and within our brains and kind of like get it out on the page. I don't think that ethnic writers are bound to write ethnic books. Does it help? Yeah, but at the end of the day, if you're picking up a book by somebody who has a different last name, I think that still helps the market. And I think it still helps to raise awareness. That's a really good thing. Partially, it's just an academic exercise, isn't it? It's all about making sure that our names are out there and that they can be seen. There is a writer out there named Tess Gerritsen, who is Asian and who writes medical thrillers. And she doesn't really address the fact that she's Asian. Her hero is an Asian. That's totally cool. She still writes a fine medical thriller, you know, and she writes fine books. The fact that she's Asian is just an added bonus. You know, it's kind of nice to have a role model to look up to. So that's a really good thing too.
Many characters.
Right.
So
the question has to deal with this multicultural world we're living in, right?
Yeah.
And it's about how writers can draw accurately from different cultures in order to be able to write characters that are engaging or write storylines that are engaging, right? I think that people who pay attention to their surroundings tend to write the truths. I am very much Asian American. I have, you know, an American part and I have an Asian cultural background, right? And I think those two parts are equally important to my upbringing. So long as I write those truthfully and I feel like I've represented them well, or that I have enough information to do that, then I feel like I'm okay. But the other part of your question also touches on this idea of cultural appropriation again, right? At which point is it okay for somebody who's one ethnicity to write about another ethnicity? For instance, if I were to write a Mexican character, what due diligence do I feel like I have to do in order to be able to convey that character and his or her ethnicity appropriately, right? For me, so the young adult writers do this very, very well, because I guarantee you the people who are writing the Harry Potters or the Fault in Our Stars books, they're not 18 and 19, they're in their 30s, you know? So how is it that they're able to convey that world so accurately that we crack open these books and we think to ourselves, oh my God, this writer has put me right back into high school. I'm feeling all these terrible things that I felt in high school. How do they do it, right? So what they've done is to convey that experience that they remember and they recall so well, but they're also probably spending a lot of time around high school students. You know, they're probably, I know John Green, I think, did a lot of teaching in his background. Most people who write young adult books or who write middle grade books spend a lot lot of time around kids of that age. So it's definitely one of those things where there is some research involved, but there is also the sensitivity of putting yourself in that person's shoes, right? If you're writing about high school students, you're putting yourself right into that terrible, awkward time of high school. And if you're writing about another ethnicity, well, then you had better spend your time around Latino folks or around LGBTQ folks, or around people that you can really get into getting to know them about, But there is a certain level of imagination, right?
Yeah.
Jack Reacher, he's not the author, he's actually the character. Lee Child writes a character named Jack Reacher, okay? And a reporter asked him one time, well, I don't understand, like, you've never had anybody kidnapped from you. How is it that you feel okay writing so accurately about this terrible kidnapping? And Lee Child said, well, I have never had anybody kidnapped, but I did lose my child one time in a grocery store for half an hour. And it was terrifying, So, he took that experience and he remembered it, right? That core of fear, and then he just kind of ballooned it outwards to imagine what it would be like if you were missing your child for not just half an hour, but days at a time, months at a time, weeks at a time. What must that feel like, right? It must sort of spiral out of control, and you must feel a certain sense of true loss. Am I ever going to get this child back again? And I think some of that putting yourself in somebody else's shoes is recalling what it's like, and writing truthfully is recalling what it was like when you were close to an experience that this person may have had, and then being able to convey that accurately on the page so that it feels like a full, fleshed out world, which is not to say that I would recommend that writers just willy-nilly write other cultures because it's the hip thing to do or whatever. But I do think there is a certain sense of validity about that, and there is certainly a leg to stand on for writers who want to try that kind of thing. That's a wrap.
Thanks. Thank you.